I never thought 5 words could destroy a mother's heart so completely. But there I was, sitting in my kitchen in Portland, Oregon, staring at my laptop screen as the rain drummed against the windows. The email from my daughter Melody had just arrived, and those 5 words glowed on the screen like a neon sign. "Don't come to my wedding." My hands trembled as I read the rest of the message. "Mom, I've decided to have a small, intimate ceremony. Please don't come to the venue. You can watch the live stream instead. I'll send you the link. Love, Melody." Love? How could she sign it with love after stabbing me in the heart? I'm Rebecca Martinez, 53 years old, and I've spent the last 28 years of my life devoted to my daughter. After her father walked out when she was just 3, it had been just the 2 of us against the world. I worked double shifts as a nurse at Portland General Hospital, sometimes pulling 16-hour days during flu season. Also, Melody could have the opportunities I never had. I sacrificed my own dreams of going back to school, sold my mother's jewelry when times got really tough, and put every penny I could spare into her college fund. When she graduated from Stanford with honors, I was the proudest mother in that auditorium, crying so hard that the woman next to me offered me her entire pack of tissues. Now, she was getting married to Dylan Whitmore, a successful tech entrepreneur from Seattle, whose family owned half the real estate in Bellevue, and I wasn't even invited to witness the most important day of her life. The kitchen felt suffocating. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and walked to the window. The Pacific Northwest autumn was in full swing, with golden leaves swirling in the wind and the smell of wood smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. The neighborhood was quiet, except for Mrs. Chen next door raking leaves in her front yard, the same yard where Melody used to help her plant tulips every spring when she was little. This should have been the happiest time of my life. Instead, I felt like I was drowning. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister Carmen. "How are the wedding preparations going? I can't wait to see Melody in her dress. Did you find the perfect mother of the bride outfit yet?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. How could I explain that my own daughter had essentially uninvited me from her wedding? That she preferred I watch it on a computer screen like some stranger scrolling through social media? Carmen had been so excited about the wedding, already planning to drive up from Sacramento with her whole family. I tried calling Melody, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again an hour later. Same result. By the 3rd attempt, I realized she was deliberately avoiding me. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every conversation we'd had over the past few months, searching for clues about what had gone wrong. Sure, I'd had some concerns about Dylan. He came from old money, the kind of family that summered in the Hamptons and had their names on museum wings. When I'd met him at their engagement party 6 months ago, he'd been polite but distant, like I was some curiosity he couldn't quite figure out. But I kept my reservations to myself. I wanted Melody to be happy, and she seemed to glow whenever she talked about him. So what had changed? The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. I made my usual cup of coffee, extra strong, and sat down to compose a response to Melody's email. I typed and deleted a dozen different messages. Some were angry, some were pleading, all of them felt inadequate. Finally, I settled on something simple. "Melody, I don't understand why you don't want me there. Can we please talk? I love you. Mom." Her response came within minutes. "Mom, it's complicated. The venue has limited capacity, and Dylan's family has a lot of people they need to invite. I'm sorry, but this is how it has to be. Limited capacity." I'd helped her research venues for months. The Cascade Manor in the Columbia River Gorge could easily accommodate 300 guests. And suddenly, there wasn't room for her own mother? That's when it hit me. This wasn't about capacity. This was about class. Dylan's family didn't want a working-class nurse from East Portland sitting at their elegant reception. They wanted Melody to herself, to mold her into their image of what a Whitmore wife should be. The realization made me sick to my stomach. Had I raised my daughter to be ashamed of where she came from, to choose status over family? I thought back to all the times over the years when I'd worried that maybe I wasn't enough for her, that maybe my working class background would somehow hold her back. But I'd never imagined she'd try to erase me entirely. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions at the hospital but unable to focus on my patients. During my break, I found myself in the chapel, a small, quiet room with stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns on the simple wooden pews. I wasn't particularly religious, but sometimes I came here when I needed to think. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly patient I'd been caring for, found me there. "Nurse Martinez," she said, settling into the pew beside me with a soft grunt. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world today." Before I knew it, I was telling her everything. About the email, about my suspicions regarding Dylan's family, about the crushing disappointment of being excluded from the most important day of my daughter's life. Mrs. Patterson had 8 children and 23 grandchildren, so she'd seen her share of family drama. "You know what this sounds like to me?" she said finally, her arthritic hand patting mine. "It sounds like your daughter is caught between 2 worlds, and she's making the wrong choice because she's scared. But fear makes people do foolish things. Maybe there's a way to help her remember who she really is." "What do you mean?" "Sometimes people need to be reminded of their roots, not in a cruel way, but in a way that opens their eyes to what they're about to lose. Love has a funny way of breaking through walls that shame builds up." Her words stayed with me as I finished my shift and drove home through the evening traffic. Portland's skyline glittered in the distance, the city lights reflecting off the Willamette River like scattered diamonds. The familiar sight of the bridges, the Burnside, the Morrison, the Hawthorne, felt like a homecoming every time I saw them. This was my home, my world. It was where I'd raised Melody, where we'd built our life together after her father left us with nothing but a stack of bills and broken promises. That night, I made a decision. If Melody wanted to exclude me from her wedding, that was her choice, but I wasn't going to make it easy for her to forget who she was and where she came from. I wasn't going to let the Whitmore family erase 28 years of love and sacrifice without a fight. I was going to send her a gift, a very special gift that would remind everyone at that wedding of the woman who'd raised her, the struggles we'd overcome together, and the love that had gotten us through it all. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. I took a leave of absence from the hospital, telling my supervisor that I needed time to deal with a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. Losing your daughter to a world that required her to deny her roots felt like the biggest emergency of my life. My first stop was Melody's old bedroom, which I'd preserved exactly as she'd left it when she moved to Seattle for her job at Pinnacle Marketing. The walls were covered with photos from our life together. Camping trips to Crater Lake, where she'd caught her first fish, her high school graduation where she'd given the valedictorian speech in both English and Spanish, volunteer work at the local animal shelter, where she'd spent every Saturday for 3 years, Christmas mornings when it was just the 2 of us opening presents while eating my mother's traditional tamales. I selected the most meaningful photos and had them professionally scanned and enlarged at Costco. The teenage employee working the photo counter looked at them with genuine interest. "These are beautiful," she said, holding up the picture of Melody teaching vacation Bible school at our local church. "Is this your daughter?" When I nodded, she smiled. "She looks so happy in all of these. You can tell she was raised with love. If only Dylan's family could see what this stranger saw so easily." Then I visited our old neighborhood in East Portland, the modest duplex on Southeast Division, where we'd lived for 15 years. The area had gentrified significantly since we'd moved. Trendy coffee shops and artisanal donut stores where the old taco trucks used to park. But our little house looked exactly the same. The current tenants, a young couple with 2 small children, were happy to let me take pictures of the front porch where Melody had learned to ride her bike, falling down a dozen times before she finally found her balance. The backyard, where she'd planted her first garden at age 7, so proud of her cherry tomatoes that she'd made me taste them every single day until they were ripe. Your daughter lived here?" the young mother asked, bouncing a toddler on her hip. "The neighbors still talk about her. Mrs. Rodriguez next door says she used to help all the elderly people on the block with their groceries every week. That was my Melody, always thinking of others, always willing to help. When had she lost that generous spirit? But the real centerpiece of my plan required a trip to Powell's Books, Portland's legendary independent bookstore that took up an entire city block. I spent hours in the memoir section, reading stories of mothers and daughters, of family bonds that transcended social class and economic status. The elderly volunteer working that section, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, noticed me sitting cross-legged on the floor with a stack of books. "Looking for something specific, dear?" she asked. "Something about remembering where you come from," I said, feeling foolish. She nodded knowingly and led me to a different shelf. "Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we write ourselves," she said, pulling out a beautiful leather-bound journal with blank pages. "Tell your own story. No one else can tell it quite the same way." Back home I began writing. Not just any story, but our story. The real story of how Melody Martinez had become the woman she was today. I wrote for hours, my hand cramping from gripping the pen so tightly, tears sometimes falling onto the pages and smudging the ink. I wrote about the night she was born, during a fierce winter storm that knocked out power to half the city. How the backup generators at the hospital had kicked in just as she was crowning, and I'd held her in the candlelit room afterward, promising her that no matter what challenges we faced, we'd face them together. "Mia," I'd whispered to her tiny, perfect face, "you and me against the world." I wrote about her first day of kindergarten, how she'd cried and clung to my scrubs until I convinced her that school was just another adventure we were taking together. How proud she'd been when she came home that afternoon, chattering in both English and Spanish about her new friends and the books they'd read. I wrote about the Christmas when she was 8, when money was so tight I could only afford one present for her. I'd worked extra shifts for weeks, but an unexpected car repair had wiped out my Christmas budget. She'd opened the small wrapped box to find a handmade coupon book filled with promises. Good for one camping trip, good for one day at the zoo, good for one homemade birthday cake with your name in frosting, good for one movie night with all your favorite snacks. She'd hugged me so tight I could barely breathe and said it was the best present ever because it meant more time with me. I wrote about her teenage years, the nights she'd come home from school upset about something a classmate had said or done, and how we'd sit on the front porch eating ice cream straight from the container and talking until the stars came out. How she'd confided in me about her first crush, her fears about fitting in, her dreams of changing the world somehow. "Mom," she'd said one night when she was 16, "promise me we'll always be this close. Promise me I'll never become one of those people who forgets where they came from." I promised, never imagining that someday she'd be the one trying to forget. I wrote about her acceptance to Stanford, how we'd both cried when the letter arrived, me from pride, her from excitement and terror. How I'd worked triple shifts for months to help pay for her expenses, surviving on coffee and determination. How proud I was watching her walk across that stage 4 years later, knowing that every sacrifice had been worth it. I wrote about the day she'd called to tell me about Dylan, her voice bubbling with happiness. "Mom, I've met someone amazing. He's smart and funny and he makes me want to be a better person." I'd been so happy for her, so grateful that she'd found love. If only I'd known that loving him would require her to stop loving herself. Every memory was a thread in the tapestry of our relationship, and as I wrote, I realized something important. Dylan's money and social status couldn't buy what Melody and I had built together through 28 years of love, sacrifice, and shared dreams. They couldn't purchase the bond forged through midnight fevers and homework struggles, through celebrations and heartbreaks, through all the small moments that make up a life lived together. While I wrote, I also researched. I looked up the Whitmore family, learning about their business empire built on real estate and tech investments. Richard Whitmore had started with a small construction company and built it into a multi-million-dollar development firm. His wife Eleanor came from old Seattle money, the kind of family that had been part of the city's elite since the logging boom days. I found photos of their previous family weddings, elaborate affairs at country clubs and historic estates, with guest lists that read like a who's who of Pacific Northwest society. I could see why Melody might feel intimidated, why she might think her working-class mother wouldn't fit in. The Whitmore weddings looked like movie sets, perfect and polished, and utterly devoid of the kind of warmth and authentic emotion that had filled our small celebrations over the years. But I also found something else. Articles about Dylan's younger sister Victoria, who'd struggled with drug addiction and had been in and out of rehab for years. Photos of his father Richard at charity galas, always with a different young woman on his arm, a secretary, a business partner, a family friend, while his wife Eleanor maintained a carefully composed smile beside him, a family that looked perfect from the outside, but was clearly dealing with their own serious problems behind closed doors. There were whispers in the society pages about Richard's business practices, lawsuits that had been quietly settled, environmental concerns about some of his developments. Eleanor's charity work seemed focused more on photo opportunities than actual impact. This was the family that thought they were too good for a hard-working nurse who'd raised her daughter with integrity and love. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Melody was making a mistake. Not in marrying Dylan. If she loved him, that was her choice. But in trying to erase her past to fit into his world. As the wedding date approached, I finalized my plan. The journal would be the centerpiece, but I wanted to include something more tangible, something that would make an immediate impact. I spent an entire day in my kitchen, recreating Melody's favorite childhood meal, my grandmother's recipe for pozole rojo, the Mexican soup that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. I'd taught Melody to make it when she was 12, and we'd prepared it together every year on her birthday. But this wasn't just about the food. It was about heritage, about the proud Mexican-American roots that Melody seemed to have forgotten in her rush to become a Whitmore. The pozole recipe had been passed down from my great-grandmother Rosa, who'd brought it with her when she crossed the border in 1923, with nothing but the clothes on her back and dreams of a better life for her children. My grandmother had taught it to my mother, who taught it to me, and I'd taught it to Melody. Each generation had added their own touch. My grandmother's secret blend of spices, my mother's technique for perfectly tender hominy, my own addition of fresh lime and cilantro. I carefully packaged the soup in a thermal container, along with fresh tortillas that I'd made by hand the way my mother had taught me, and all the traditional garnishes, diced white onion, thinly sliced radishes, dried oregano, and lime wedges cut just so. I included the handwritten recipe card, stained with decades of use and love, along with a note. For Melody, so you never forget where you came from and who loves you most. Love, Mama. I hadn't called myself Mama in years, not since Melody had decided during her sophomore year at Stanford that it sounded too ethnic and asked me to use Mom instead. It's just easier, she'd said, avoiding my eyes. People don't know how to pronounce it right. But today, I reclaimed that word, that identity, that connection to our shared heritage. The final element was the mariachi band. I'd found Los Hermanos del Valle, a group of talented musicians who specialized in traditional Mexican wedding music and had been performing at celebrations throughout the Pacific Northwest for over 20 years. The lead singer, Miguel, had listened patiently as I explained what I needed, and his eyes had grown soft with understanding. Señora, he'd said in Spanish, we've seen this before. Young people who forget where they come from, who think they need to be someone else to be worthy of love. Music has a way of calling them home. They were expensive, more than I'd planned to spend, but I'd been saving for months to buy Melody a wedding gift. I'd imagined something traditional, maybe a set of china or silver, something that would help her start her new life. This wasn't exactly what I'd planned, but it was what she needed. Sometimes the most important gifts aren't the ones we think we want, but the ones that remind us who we really are. 3 days before the wedding, I shipped everything to the Cascade Manor with specific instructions for delivery during the reception. The package was addressed to Melody Martinez Whitmore, emphasizing both parts of her identity, and marked time-sensitive wedding gift. Please deliver immediately upon arrival. I'd also included a letter to the event coordinator, explaining that this was a surprise from the bride's family and that the mariachi band should be allowed to set up and begin playing as soon as they arrived. I'd prepaid for everything and included generous tips, knowing that money talks when you need people to follow unusual instructions. As I watched the delivery truck pull away from my house, I felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. I didn't know how Melody would react, but I knew I had to try. She was my daughter, and I wasn't going to let her disappear into a world that required her to deny who she was. The night before the wedding, I received the Livestream link as promised. I set up my laptop in the living room, surrounded by all the photos and mementos from our life together. If I couldn't be there in person, at least I'd be there in spirit. I tried calling Melody one last time, but as expected, it went to voicemail. "Mija," I said, using the Spanish endearment I'd called her since she was a baby. "I love you no matter what. I hope your wedding day is everything you've dreamed of. But remember, you are perfect just as you are. You don't need to change for anyone." As I hung up, I wondered if I'd made the right choice. By tomorrow evening, I'd either have my daughter back, or I might lose her forever. The morning of Melody's wedding dawned crisp and clear in Portland, the kind of October day that makes you grateful to live in the Pacific Northwest. The sky was that perfect blue you only get after a storm has cleared the air, and Mount Hood stood majestically in the distance, its snow-capped peak catching the early sunlight. I'd barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities of what might happen when my gift arrived at the Cascade Manor. I made coffee and sat down at my laptop, checking the live stream link over and over, even though I knew the ceremony wouldn't begin for hours. At 10 a.m., I finally clicked on it and was greeted by a stunning view of the Columbia River Gorge, with the elegant stone manor perched on a cliff overlooking the water. The venue was even more beautiful than the photos had suggested. Massive windows reflecting the river, terraced gardens cascading down the hillside, and a ceremony space that looked like something from a fairy tale. The venue was everything I'd imagined it would be. Perfectly manicured gardens with late blooming roses, white hydrangeas and baby's breath arranged in towering displays. A string quartet playing Vivaldi softly in the background. Guests were beginning to arrive, and I recognized some of them from the engagement party, Dylan's family and friends, all dressed in expensive clothes, and speaking in the kind of cultured tones that come from prep school educations and summer houses in Martha's Vineyard. The live stream camera captured everything in high definition, from the crystal champagne flutes being served on silver trays to the way the autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the manor. It was exactly the kind of wedding that would end up in the society pages, the kind of event that cost more than most people made in a year. At noon, the camera focused on the bridal party getting ready in what looked like a luxury hotel suite. And there was my daughter, looking absolutely radiant in a designer gown that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. The dress was stunning, layers of silk and lace that caught the light as she moved, with intricate beadwork that must have taken hundreds of hours to complete. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and she wore her grandmother's pearl earrings, the only piece of our family that had made it into her wedding ensemble. Watching her, I felt a pang of regret. Maybe I'd been wrong to send the gift. Maybe I should have just accepted that this was the life she wanted, even if it meant losing the daughter I'd raised. But then I noticed something that made my heart ache. Melody kept checking her phone, and there was a tightness around her eyes that I recognized from all the years I'd spent watching her face. She was anxious, maybe even scared. This wasn't the glowing, happy bride I'd expected to see. The ceremony began at 2 p.m. Dylan looked handsome in his custom tuxedo, standing at the altar with his groomsmen, all of them tall, blonde, and indistinguishable from each other in their Ivy League uniformity. The officiant, a family friend rather than a minister, began with generic words about love and commitment. As Melody walked down the aisle, my breath caught in my throat. She was beautiful, but she looked like a stranger. Everything about her, from her straightened hair to her carefully neutral expression, seemed designed to erase the vibrant, passionate young woman I'd raised. The ceremony proceeded without incident for the first 20 minutes. Standard vows, a reading from Khalil Gibran, more generic platitudes about marriage. I found myself checking the time, wondering when my gift would arrive. Then, just as the officiant was asking if anyone had any objections to the union, there was a commotion at the back of the venue. Through the live stream, I could see someone gesturing frantically at Dylan's father, Richard Whitmore, who was sitting in the front row. The audio picked up snippets of conversation. Delivery insists it's urgent, bride's mother. Richard's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, annoyance, and then something that looked like panic. He leaned over to whisper something to his wife Eleanor, who immediately stood up and hurried toward the back of the venue. The officiant, clearly unsure what to do, continued with the ceremony. But Dylan was distracted now, craning his neck to see what was happening. Melody looked mortified, her carefully composed facade beginning to crack. That's when I heard it through the live stream, the unmistakable sound of mariachi music floating across the grounds. Los Hermanos del Valle had arrived. The guitar and trumpet melodies of Las Mañanitas, the traditional Mexican birthday song, drifted through the air, getting louder as the musicians apparently made their way toward the ceremony. The guests began murmuring, their heads turning toward the sound. But the real drama was happening off camera. Through the live stream, I could see Eleanor Whitmore engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone just out of view. Her perfectly coiffed hair was beginning to come undone, and her face had gone from pale to flushed. Dylan finally stopped the ceremony altogether. "I'm sorry," he said to the officiant. "We need to handle this situation." The camera followed him as he strode toward the disturbance, with Melody hurrying behind him in her elaborate gown. What they found at the reception area made Dylan's jaw drop. The mariachi band had set up near the gift table and was playing enthusiastically, their colorful traditional costumes a stark contrast to the sea of neutral wedding attire. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was the enormous display that had been set up alongside the gift table. Blown-up photos from Melody's childhood and teenage years covered 3 large poster boards. Melody at age 5, grinning with chocolate cake smeared on her face at her birthday party in our tiny duplex. Melody at 10, proudly holding up a fish she'd caught on our camping trip to the Oregon coast. Melody at 16, volunteering at the homeless shelter downtown, her hair in braids and wearing a t-shirt that read, "Proud to be Chicana." And in the center of it all was a table set with traditional Mexican decorations, papel picado, bright flores, and a steaming pot of pozole with all the accompaniments I'd prepared. Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen, staring at the display like it was a traffic accident she couldn't look away from. Several guests had gathered around, reading the handwritten signs I'd included with each photo, explaining the significance of each memory. But the real shock came when Dylan picked up the leather journal I'd included and began reading aloud. The story of Melody Martinez, a daughter of immigrants who never forgot her roots. His voice trailed off as he flipped through the pages, his expression changing from annoyance to something more complex. Meanwhile, the mariachi band launched into Cielito Lindo, and some of the younger guests actually began clapping along. Melody stood in the middle of it all, her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup, but she seemed unable to move or speak. That's when Dylan's sister Victoria stepped forward. I recognized her from the family photos I'd researched. She was the one who'd struggled with addiction, the black sheep of the perfect Whitmore family. She picked up one of the photos, the one of Melody teaching vacation Bible school at our local church. "This is beautiful," she said loudly enough for the live stream to pick up. "Dylan, you never told me Melody was so involved in community service. And look at this. She speaks Spanish fluently. The comment seemed to break the spell. Melody finally found her voice. "Victoria, please don't what?" Victoria interrupted. "Don't be impressed that you come from a family that actually cares about giving back to their community. Don't admire that your mother worked double shifts to put you through college. Because that's what this journal says, and it's amazing." The tension was palpable. Richard Whitmore looked like he was about to have a stroke, while Eleanor appeared to be calculating the social damage this would cause. But something unexpected was happening among the other guests. Instead of being scandalized, many of them seemed genuinely interested in the display. An older woman I didn't recognize picked up the recipe card for the pozzoli and commented, "This looks delicious. Is this a family recipe, dear?" Another guest was reading the journal over Dylan's shoulder, nodding appreciatively at the stories of resilience and determination. The mariachi band, sensing the mood, transitioned into a softer, more romantic song, "Besame Mucho." The music filled the awkward silence, creating a moment of unexpected beauty. That's when Dylan did something that surprised everyone, including me. He closed the journal, walked over to Melody, and took her hands in his. "Why didn't you tell me about any of this?" he asked, his voice gentle but serious. "Why didn't you tell me about your mother's sacrifices, about your volunteer work, about your heritage?" Melody's response was barely audible through the live stream. "Because I thought you wouldn't want me if you knew where I really came from." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Dylan's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, hurt, and finally understanding. "Melody," he said, "I fell in love with you. Not with some version of you that you thought I wanted. If you've been hiding who you really are." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The ceremony had stopped, the guests were murmuring, and my daughter was standing in the middle of it all, finally being forced to confront the choice she'd made. The live stream continued for another few minutes, but nothing more was said. The officiant awkwardly suggested that everyone take a break, and the camera feed eventually cut out. I sat in my living room staring at the blank screen, wondering what I'd just done. Had I saved my daughter from making a terrible mistake, or had I just ruined her wedding day? Only time would tell. 3 hours passed before my phone rang. 3 hours of pacing around my house, replaying the scene from the live stream over and over, wondering if I'd just destroyed the most important relationship in my life. I'd watched the aftermath through social media posts from guests, blurry photos of the mariachi band, confused comments about the unexpected entertainment, and one particularly telling post from someone who'd written, "Well, that was certainly memorable." When I saw Melody's name on the caller ID, my heart nearly stopped. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. "Mom?" Her voice was small, uncertain, raw from crying. Nothing like the confident young woman who'd written that cold email just days before. "Mija, I'm here. I need to come home. Can you pick me up? I'm at the manor still, but everyone's gone except for a few stragglers and the cleanup crew." "Of course, baby, I'll be right there." The drive to the Columbia River Gorge felt like the longest hour of my life. Traffic on I-84 was heavy with weekend travelers heading back from their mountain getaways, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The autumn landscape blurred past, golden fields dotted with red barns, rolling hills covered in vineyards, the Columbia River winding through the gorge like a silver ribbon reflecting the late afternoon sun. I kept replaying Dylan's words from the live stream, the shock on his face when he'd realized how much of Melody's life she'd been hiding from him, the way his voice had cracked when he'd asked her why she didn't trust him enough to be honest. I couldn't decide if I felt sorry for him or grateful that he'd finally seen the truth. I found Melody sitting on a stone bench outside the Cascade Manor, still in her wedding dress, but with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her elaborate hairstyle had come completely undone, dark curls falling around her face, and mascara streaks marked her cheeks, but she'd never looked more beautiful to me. She looked young again, vulnerable, like the little girl who used to run to me when she'd scraped her knee or had a bad dream. She got into the car without saying a word, and we drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. The radio was playing softly, some classic rock station, and I could hear her sniffling occasionally, but she stared out the window at the passing landscape as if she were seeing it for the first time. Finally, as we passed through the small town of Corbett with its antique shops and roadside fruit stands, she spoke. "The wedding is postponed," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened after the live stream cut out?" Melody took a shaky breath, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Dylan and I talked, really talked for the first time in months. He asked me why I'd been so determined to hide my background, why I'd straightened my hair and stopped speaking Spanish and changed everything about myself. He said he'd been wondering for weeks why I seemed so different from the woman he'd fallen in love with." She paused, staring out the window at the passing landscape. "I told him it was because I was afraid that his family would think I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong in their world." "And what did he say?" "He said he was hurt that I didn't trust him enough to be honest, that he'd fallen in love with the woman I was when we first met, confident, passionate, proud of where I came from. He said he'd been wondering for months why I'd become so different." I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Dylan wasn't the snob I'd feared he might be, but sadness that my daughter had felt she needed to become someone else to be worthy of love. "His parents were furious," Melody continued. "His mother actually said that this was exactly why they'd hoped Dylan would marry someone from an appropriate background. She said the display was vulgar and embarrassing." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "And Dylan? What did he say to that?" "He told his mother that if she couldn't accept me for who I really am, then maybe she shouldn't be at our wedding at all." A surge of unexpected appreciation for Dylan ran through me. Maybe I'd misjudged him. But Victoria, Dylan's sister, she was amazing. She stood up to their parents and said that everything in your display showed exactly the kind of person she'd want as a sister-in-law. She said she wished she had half my strength and determination. We were entering Portland now, the city's skyline coming into view, the familiar sight of Mount Hood in the distance, the bridges spanning the Willamette River, the quirky mix of old and new architecture. It all felt like a homecoming. "Mom," Melody said as we pulled into our old neighborhood, "I owe you an apology. A huge apology." I parked in front of the house and turned to face her. "Mija, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Her voice was stronger now, more like the daughter I remembered. I was so focused on fitting into Dylan's world that I forgot about my own. I forgot about the woman who raised me, who sacrificed everything for my dreams. I forgot about our traditions, our family, our history. She reached into her purse and pulled out the leather journal I'd sent. "I read this, Mom, every word, and I realized that I've been trying to erase the most important parts of myself." We sat in the car for another hour, talking about everything that had happened over the past few months. Melody told me about the subtle pressure she'd felt from Dylan's family, how they'd made comments about her accent when she spoke Spanish, how they'd suggested she might want to refine her wardrobe and her interests. "I thought I had to choose," she said, "between the life I'd always known and the life I wanted with Dylan. I didn't realize I could have both. And now I know that if Dylan truly loves me, he'll love all of me, including the part that makes pozole on special occasions and speaks Spanish with her mother and is proud to be Mexican-American." We finally went inside, and I made coffee while Melody changed out of her wedding dress. When she came downstairs wearing jeans and one of her old Stanford t-shirts, she looked like herself again, confident, natural, beautiful in her own skin. Over the next few days, we talked more than we had in years. Melody told me about her fears, her insecurities, her desperate desire to be accepted by Dylan's family. I told her about my own struggles, how I'd sometimes felt intimidated by her success, worried that she'd outgrown her working-class mother. "Mom," she said on the third day, as we were making tamales together in the kitchen, something we hadn't done in over 2 years, "I want to reschedule the wedding, but I want to do it differently this time." "What do you mean?" "I want it to be a real celebration of both families, both cultures. I want mariachi music and traditional Mexican food alongside the fancy catering. I want to wear abuela's mantilla with my dress. I want to have the ceremony in both English and Spanish." She paused, her hands stilling on the masa she was spreading. "And I want you to walk me down the aisle." I felt tears spring to my eyes. "Mija, what about Dylan? How does he feel about all this?" "He loves it. He's been learning Spanish from a tutor, and he wants to include some Mexican traditions in the ceremony. He said he wants to marry all of me, not just the parts I thought were acceptable." True to her word, Melody rescheduled the wedding for the following spring. But this time, it was a true celebration of two families coming together. The ceremony was held at a beautiful hacienda-style venue in wine country, with both mariachi music and classical strings, with traditional Mexican flowers alongside the elegant white roses. Dylan's family was adjusting. His parents remained somewhat stiff and formal, but Victoria had become one of Melody's closest friends, and Dylan's cousins seemed genuinely interested in learning about Mexican traditions. More importantly, Dylan himself had embraced this new version of their relationship. He'd learned to make pozole, though not as well as Melody or me, had started taking Spanish lessons, and had even asked me to teach him some of my grandmother's recipes. The night before the rescheduled wedding, as I was putting the finishing touches on Melody's veil, the same mantilla my grandmother had worn in 1952, my daughter took my hands in hers. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not letting me disappear." "You're my daughter," I replied. "I would never let that happen." The wedding was beautiful, a perfect blend of elegance and tradition, of old and new. As I walked Melody down the aisle, I saw Dylan's face light up when he saw her. Not the carefully constructed version she'd been trying to become, but the real Melody, proud and radiant and authentically herself. During the reception, as the mariachi band played and guests from both families danced together, I realized that sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the courage to be themselves. My daughter had almost lost herself trying to become someone else's idea of perfect, but she'd found her way back to who she really was. And as I watched her dance with her new husband to Cielito Lindo, her grandmother's mantilla flowing behind her, I knew that she would never forget again where she came from, or who had helped her get there. The email that had broken my heart had led to the most beautiful wedding I'd ever seen. Sometimes the most painful moments in our lives are just the beginning of something wonderful. Sometimes a mother's love is the only gift that matters.